as Iranians continue to protest their government across the country. We'll talk to State Department spokeswoman Heather Nauert in just a few minutes. Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Daily Briefing. Steve, let me ask you about Iran, if you don't mind. I mean, you've got the whole world that we have to talk about, but we only have a few minutes. President Trump this morning tweeting, such respect for the people of Iran as they try to take back their corrupt government. You will see great support from the United States at the appropriate time. Do you know what that actually might entail? I know you might not have details, but is providing possibly ways for them to continue to communicate through technology one of the ways we can help?
Well, look, all of this we are monitoring very, very carefully and very closely. One of the things that we know as a government, and Dana, you know better than anyone, when the United States government speaks out on behalf of people who are going through a very difficult time, that means a lot to those people. As Americans, we may take that for granted, but we have seen the success in Venezuela, where we have heard people, when there's been a clampdown on the media, saying thank you for speaking out on our behalf. We stand with the people of Iran. We stand with the Iranian people. They have a rich and wonderful history. We don't take issue with the people of Iran. With the regime, we have concerns with that. They're protesting the economy, they're protesting corruption, and they're frankly tired of Iranian officials taking the money that should be spent on their own country, funding a foreign terrorist organization, Hezbollah, and we know the horrible things that Hezbollah has done to our U.S. service members overseas for decades and decades. They're also funding problems in Syria and in Yemen as well as many other places.
Yesterday,
so Iranian people, we stand with you.
Yesterday, Ambassador Nikki Haley suggested that there would be a call for a UN meeting, a Security Council meeting about Iran. When do you think that will happen, and what do you want to get out of it?
Yeah, so I don't want to get ahead of Ambassador Haley on that because no meeting date or time has yet been announced. But I think as we look to many of our allies and our partners around the world, they share our concerns. And that is enabling these protesters in Iran to protest peacefully. And that means a lot to those people to hear that we support their right to free speech. And they're doing it so bravely because they could be imprisoned as a result. We're watching that very carefully because if there are human rights abuses on the part of government officials, that is an enormous concern to us, and that is why we are watching that very carefully when we are urging restraint on the part of the Iranian regime.
Let me just follow up with you on that because already I think it's up to 20 people who have lost their lives, protesters. And then, Sohrab Ahmari, he's of Commentary Magazine. He'll be here later in the show. He was telling me about the people who are arrested, up to over maybe even 400 now, that they will at the very least experience torture. What can the United States do besides urging Iran not to do such a thing, that we're watching them from a humanitarian standpoint? Is there anything else we can do to help prevent that?
Well, Dana, as you well know, our information from the ground in Iran is somewhat limited. We have to work with other countries. We have to work with partner organizations, NGOs, for example, aid groups, intelligence, and all of that to try to get information. It's tough to get information out of there, but we're watching it closely, and we certainly hope that Iran will use restraint.
And it's hard to get covert information out of there.
It's hard to get a lot of information out
All right,
of there.
Heather Nauert, you're always welcome here on the Daily Briefing. Thanks
Dana,
for being
great
here.
to see you. All right, thank you.
Bye-bye. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle announcing support for anti-government protesters in Iran. This comes as Iranian officials organized a series of pro-government rallies today in at least 10 cities across that country. Today's events were a response to the previous days of often violent demonstrations that have claimed the lives of at least 21 people. Joining me now is Sohrab Ahmari, senior writer at Commentary Magazine. You've been covering this from the beginning. I encourage everyone to follow him on Twitter as well because you have really good updates, and I want to get to one in particular. But tell me, are the protests growing as well as continuing, the ones that are against the government?
Well, the size is not as big as it was in 2009 when you had 3 million people in the capital at one point. But you're seeing lots of scattered protests, and it's much more nationwide, even in really small towns and hamlets, if you will. So they're continuing, but they're just not being able to amass, and that's partly because the security response, as usual with this regime, is so brutal.
And tell me about that, because there's concern about the fate of the protesters and how they're targeted. That's what I wanted to ask you about. You were alerting Twitter support today.
Targeted sanctions, an announcement that, if you are identified as a major human rights violator in these events, the United States will block your access to international markets and impose sanctions on your
Will Europe
travel.
go along with that? Because, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, our ambassador to the UN, she said that she's calling for an emergency meeting, the Security Council. But if Europe has already figured into their plans ways to do business with Iran, are they going to join us in fighting back against a regime that has terrible human rights violations?
It's one of the problems with this nuclear deal is it bakes desanctioning the regime into the process of the deal. So the Europeans will say, won't this be a violation of the nuclear deal? But the nuclear deal is narrowly focused on the nuclear issues. The U.S., I think, can lawfully confront the regime on other things, whether it's their malicious behavior in the region, their attempts to undermine other governments, and their own domestic human rights violations. Moreover, the U.S. just has tremendous power, as you know, to shut any entity out of the financial markets, regardless of what anyone else thinks about it.
And then last quick question, what do you think President Trump will do at his next deadline of January 11th in regards to the deal?
I would hope that he does not certify the deal, because the Iranian regime has not lived up to its obligations, not least with missile testing across the region. Continue to, although this was not in the deal, but it's continued to try to undermine the sovereignty of nearby regional powers. Right. So this is not a regime that's playing ball, as the Obama administration promised it would. So I don't think the nuclear deal should be certified.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Saurabh. We appreciate it, and we hope to have you back.